Let me tell you about the night Pamela Fairbanks tried to freeze me out of my own neighborhood and ended up locking herself inside it instead. It was the kind of January that makes you question every life decision you've ever made, including the one where you thought moving to Maplewood Estates sounded like a good idea. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 9 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside, and your car doors seal shut like they were welded. We were 3 days into what the local meteorologists were dramatically calling the Arctic grip of the century, though I suspect they call every major cold snap that. The ice storm had rolled in on a Tuesday night, glazing every surface in about an inch of solid ice before dropping another 6 inches of snow on top of it. Roads were closed. Schools were shut. Half the county had lost power, including, as it turned out, most of Maplewood Estates. Not my house, though. Because I, Neil Nelson, had spent the previous October doing something that Pamela Fairbanks and the rest of the HOA board had apparently never anticipated. I bought a serious whole-home standby generator. Not one of those little portable gas cans on wheels you drag out of the garage in emergencies. I'm talking a 22-kilowatt Generac unit, professionally installed on a concrete pad on the side of my house, wired directly into my electrical panel with an automatic transfer switch. The thing kicked on within seconds of a power outage and could run my entire house indefinitely as long as I had propane in the tank, which I had filled to the brim in November because I'm the kind of person who reads weather forecasts and takes them seriously. Now, Maplewood Estates is a gated community. Has been since the developer built it in 2004. There's a wrought iron gate at the main entrance on Maplewood Drive that opens and closes on an electric motor, controlled by a keypad, a remote clicker, and a resident entry system tied to the community's electrical infrastructure. When the neighborhood has power, the gate works great. When it doesn't, the gate has a battery backup that lasts about 4 hours before the whole system defaults to a locked position, because that's how the safety failsafe was designed. Locked gate, no entry, no exit, unless you have the manual override key, which exactly 2 people possess. The HOA Property Management Company, and as I discovered later through some very interesting documentation, the previous infrastructure contractor who never returned it. Here's the part that almost nobody in the neighborhood knew, including the HOA board members who'd been running the place for 6 years. The gate's charging system, the one that kept the battery backup topped off and operational, was wired through a small electrical junction box that sat on the property line between the community entrance and my lot. That junction box drew its power from my utility service, not the main community feed. This was a quirk of the original construction, documented in the original site plans that the developer had filed with the county in 2004. The HOA had taken over management of the community in 2010, and apparently nobody on the board had ever bothered reading the original infrastructure documentation closely enough to notice this detail. The Property Management Company, a firm called Crestview Community Solutions, knew about it theoretically, because it was in the records they'd inherited, but nobody had flagged it as significant because, in 15 years of normal operation, it had never mattered. The community always had power. The grid was reliable. The gate always worked, until it wasn't, until the grid failed, until Maplewood Estates went dark on a Tuesday night in January, until my generator hummed to life in the cold, powering my house, my lights, my heat, and without me even fully realizing it at first, also keeping that junction box charged, which kept the gate battery topped off, which kept the gate functional. I figured this out on Wednesday morning when I walked out to clear my driveway and saw my neighbor across the street, Dave Kowalski, standing in his doorway looking exhausted and cold. He'd been running space heaters off an extension cord connected to a small portable generator he kept in his garage, but it wasn't cutting it. His pipes were groaning. His wife was wrapped in every blanket they owned. I told him to grab his family and come to my place. By noon on Wednesday, I had Dave's family, the elderly couple from 3 houses down, Frank and Ruth Esperanza, and a young woman named Jess Tran who just moved in at the end of the cul-de-sac, all set up in my living room. The generator was handling it without breaking a sweat. I had heat, hot water, a working stove, lights, and a fully charged phone network, because I'd also had the foresight to install a Wi-Fi router on a UPS backup system. We were the warmest, most connected house in a neighborhood that had otherwise gone completely dark. And that is exactly when Pamela Fairbanks decided to make my life difficult. Pamela lived 4 houses down on the same street, in a colonial with white shutters and a front lawn that she'd weaponized over the years, with an assortment of HOA-approved hedges and HOA-approved lawn ornaments and HOA-approved seasonal wreaths that she changed out with a level of dedication most people reserve for religious observance. She was on the HOA board as Vice President of Community Standards, a title she had clearly invented, because when I'd looked at the original HOA bylaws, the board structure listed a president, treasurer, and secretary, with no vice president of anything. She'd apparently added the role for herself at some point during a meeting where the minutes were suspiciously vague. Pamela was 53 years old, retired from some kind of insurance management position, and had discovered that running the HOA scratched whatever itch the corporate world used to provide. She was the person who sent violation notices for garbage cans left out 2 hours past collection time. She was the person who measured the height of seasonal decorations with an actual tape measure. She was the person who had submitted 11 formal complaints against 11 different homeowners in the past calendar year, which I know because I'd filed a records request with the property management company after my second violation notice, which was for having a welcome mat that was, and I quote, non-compliant in color tone with the approved neutral palette outlined in Section 4.7 of the Community Aesthetics Guidelines. I'd looked up Section 4.7. It said, and I quote, welcome mats should be of a generally neutral or understated appearance. My mat was gray. I still received the notice. So when my generator kicked on Tuesday night and was still running by Wednesday morning, I wasn't even slightly surprised when my phone buzzed with a text from Dave saying he'd seen Pamela standing in her driveway at 8 in the morning, staring at my generator, arms crossed, face doing that thing it did before she filed a complaint. I didn't have to wait long. By 9:15 Wednesday morning, I had an email from Crestview Community Solutions, timestamped 9:08 a.m., which meant Pamela had called them the moment their office opened. The email was a formal noise and nuisance violation notice citing Section 12.3 of the HOA Community Rules, which prohibited persistent mechanical noise that disturbs the peaceful enjoyment of adjoining residences, and Section 8.1, which prohibited unapproved exterior mechanical installations visible from the street or adjoining properties. The email informed me that I was required to cease operation of the generator immediately or face daily fines of $100 beginning at 5 p.m. that day. I read that email twice, sitting at my kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee while the heat pump ran quietly and my house guests slept warm in my guest room and on my pull-out couch. Then I looked out the window at the thermometer on my deck railing, which read 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I looked at the weather forecast on my phone, which said the ice and cold would persist through at least Friday. Then I laughed a little, because what Pamela and the HOA board had managed to do was pick a fight with a man who had heat, power, internet, and nothing to do except document everything meticulously. Let me tell you about my background for a moment, because it's relevant. I spent 12 years working as a facilities compliance manager for a mid-sized commercial property company. I am not an attorney, but I know how to read legal documents, how to interpret construction records, and how to file a proper response to a formal notice. I know what constitutes legitimate authority and what constitutes someone abusing a position. And I know that the single most powerful thing you can do when someone starts throwing paper at you is to throw better, more organized paper right back at them. I sent a response email to Crestview Community Solutions at 10:02 a.m. It was 4 pages long. I attached 6 documents. The first was a copy of the permit I'd pulled with the county for the generator installation, showing that it was a fully permitted and inspected installation completed in October. The second was the manufacturer's noise specification sheet for my Generac unit, showing that it operated at 67 decibels at a distance of 23 feet, which I noted was comparable to a normal conversation and was well below the threshold for noise nuisance under the county noise ordinance, which I cited. The third was the county noise ordinance itself. The fourth was a screenshot of the HOA's own governing documents, showing that Section 12.3 applied specifically to ongoing commercial or industrial operations, not to emergency residential equipment. The fifth was a printed summary of my state's emergency provisions for residential generator use, which specifically protected homeowners from HOA enforcement actions during declared emergency periods. And I included the governor's emergency declaration that had been issued for our county on Tuesday evening. The sixth was a letter from my generator installation company, confirming that the unit met all applicable residential codes and HOA compliance standards for exterior mechanical installations, noting that the concrete pad and enclosure screen I'd installed were specifically designed to satisfy aesthetic requirements. I closed the email by noting that I would be documenting all further correspondence, and that any enforcement action taken against me during a declared state of emergency, particularly one that could endanger my health or the health of the guests I was currently sheltering, might expose the HOA to significant liability. I CC'd the state's HOA Oversight Board, the County Emergency Management Office, and my personal attorney, who I'd worked with on property matters before and who I'd given a quick heads-up call to that morning. Then I went and made pancakes for 6 people because we were all hungry and the stove worked perfectly. The response from Crestview Community Solutions came back in about 2 hours. It was noticeably more hedging in tone than the original notice. It said that my response was being reviewed and that enforcement action was being held pending further assessment. It was signed by the property manager, a guy named Gary Delaney, who I suspected was having a very bad Wednesday. I imagined him reading my email attachment by attachment and slowly realizing that Pamela had walked him into a complaint he was not going to be able to make stick. But here's the thing about Pamela Fairbanks. She wasn't done. Not even close. When someone like Pamela has decided you're her target, a legally airtight response doesn't make her back down. It makes her escalate because backing down would mean admitting she was wrong, and that wasn't something she was built to do. By Thursday morning, the power was still out for the rest of the neighborhood. The utility company had updated their restoration estimate to Saturday at the earliest. The temperature had actually dropped further overnight to a brutal 6 degrees, and the wind was picking up, driving the wind chill down to something genuinely dangerous. My houseguests had been joined by 2 more neighbors, the Acafer family from around the corner, Marcus and his wife Sandra and their 2 kids, who'd run out of fuel for their space heaters. I had 8 people in my house. The generator was still running smooth as butter. I was genuinely proud of that machine. That morning, around 10, I was outside briefly shoveling a path to the generator to check the propane connection when I saw Pamela across the street, talking to a man I didn't recognize. Tall guy, heavy coat, had a clipboard. I watched them for a minute and then went back inside. An hour later, someone knocked on my door. It was a code enforcement officer. His name was Officer Ramirez from the County Code Compliance Office. He was polite, apologetic, and clearly a bit uncomfortable. He explained that he'd received a complaint that my generator installation might not meet county setback requirements and asked if he could take a look. I said absolutely and grabbed my permit folder, which I keep organized in a bright orange binder specifically, because I knew someday someone would come knocking and I wanted to be ready. I walked him through every document: the permit, the survey showing the generator's exact placement, the setback measurements, which were 12 feet from the property line on the closest side, well exceeding the 6-foot minimum requirement for residential backup generators in our county. The installation inspection certificate signed by the county's own inspector in October. Officer Ramirez looked through everything, nodded several times, wrote some notes, and told me everything appeared to be in order. He apologized for the inconvenience, said he was required to follow up on complaints even when they seemed unfounded, and left. I watched him walk back toward the street. I watched him pass Pamela, who was standing at the end of her driveway in a coat and boots and a hat, clearly waiting. I watched Officer Ramirez say something to her, watched her face go through what looked like several stages of frustration, and then watched him get in his truck and drive away. The truck made it about 30 feet down the road before it stopped, because of course, the gate was still open, still operating on battery power that was being kept charged by my junction box, which was being kept powered by my generator. And that's when I had the thought. I'd known about the junction box situation since Wednesday morning, when Dave and I had been talking about the neighborhood infrastructure, and I'd mentioned that my power seemed to be running things that shouldn't still be working. Dave had an electrical background and helped me trace it. We'd found the junction box, found the cable run, and pulled up the original site plans on the county records portal, which is public record, and confirmed what we suspected. My service connection was feeding the gate system. If my generator went off, the gate battery would stop charging, and within a few hours, the gate would fail to its locked position. Nobody in or out. I hadn't done anything with this information yet. I hadn't threatened anyone with it. I just noted it, documented it, and filed it away. That's the kind of thing I do. I document things. But now, standing at my front window watching Pamela try to weaponize county code enforcement against me during an ice storm while I was literally keeping 8 of my neighbors warm, I started to think about the possibilities. I called my attorney, Steve Mercer, that afternoon. Steve's a real estate and property law specialist who I'd used when I bought the house and again when I got the second violation notice and wanted to understand my options. I explained the full situation, the generator complaint, the code enforcement visit, the junction box, the gate. Steve went quiet for a moment and then said, very carefully, "Neil, you're not obligated to subsidize the HOA's infrastructure out of your own propane tank." He said it like he was thinking out loud rather than giving me official legal advice, but I heard him clearly. I also called Gary Delaney at Crestview Community Solutions Thursday afternoon. I told Gary, in a very calm and professional tone, that I'd become aware of an infrastructure anomaly that affected the gate system. I explained the junction box situation. I explained that my generator was currently powering the gate battery charger, and that I thought the HOA should be aware of this, both for informational purposes and because they might want to arrange an alternative power source for the gate before I made any changes to my setup. I also told Gary that I was going to need the HOA to formally confirm in writing that the generator violation complaint was withdrawn before I could commit to maintaining current operating parameters, because I was considering whether to continue running the generator in its current configuration or make some adjustments for fuel efficiency reasons. Gary was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd need to discuss this with the board. I said, "Of course, take your time. Just be aware that the propane situation is something I'll need to address before the weekend." I wasn't actually planning to shut off the generator. My neighbors were in my house. I wasn't going to endanger anyone, but I didn't have to tell Gary that. What I did do was send another formal email that evening to Crestview, attaching the site plan documentation showing the junction box and its power source connection, a written explanation of the infrastructure situation, and a formal request for the HOA to either acknowledge the arrangement and compensate me for the fuel cost of maintaining gate operations, or arrange to have the gate disconnected from my service and connected to an alternative source. I asked for a response by Friday at noon. Thursday night was interesting. The temperature hit 4 degrees. The wind was howling. Ice was still everywhere. My house guests and I played board games by lamplight in the living room while the heat ran steadily and the generator purred outside. Ruth Esperanza, who was 72 and had the energy of someone much younger, absolutely destroyed everyone at Scrabble twice. Marcus Ackerfer's kids fell asleep on the couch watching a movie on my laptop. It was genuinely one of the nicer evenings I'd had in a while, if you could set aside the apocalyptic weather outside. Around 9 p.m., I got a text from Dave, who'd gone back to his house earlier in the day because his portable generator had been enough to run the essentials once the temperature briefly ticked up to 18 during the afternoon. Dave's text said, "Pamela's been going door to door. I think she's working on a petition." I asked what kind of petition. Dave said, "She's telling people you could disconnect the gate power at any time and trap everyone. She's trying to make it sound like you're holding the neighborhood hostage." I stared at that message for a while. Then I thought about it carefully. Pamela Fairbanks had just reported my generator to county code enforcement. She was now apparently trying to frame me as a threat to the community for not guaranteeing to continue powering the gate that she'd tried to make me shut down. The logic was so twisted it was almost artistic. I sent Dave back a voice message explaining the full timeline. I hadn't done anything with the gate power. I hadn't threatened anyone. I'd simply informed the HOA of a factual situation that they should have already known about and requested they address it appropriately. I told Dave to share that timeline with anyone Pamela was talking to. Dave sent back a thumbs up and then a laughing emoji and then said, "She knocked on my door 20 minutes ago and I already told her to kick rocks." The next morning, Friday, I woke up early and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table watching the ice on the windows while I thought through everything. I had my orange binder open. I had my laptop showing the email thread. I had the site plan documentation. And I had something else I'd pulled together overnight, which was a calculation of what it had cost me in propane to run that generator from Tuesday night to Friday morning. The generator burned through propane at a rate that varied with load, but I'd kept records and done the math. At current propane prices, and accounting for the additional electrical load from the junction box, which I'd estimated from the gate system specification documents I'd found on the manufacturer's website, the HOA had been the beneficiary of somewhere between $40 and $60 of my propane since Tuesday night. That wasn't a fortune, but it was real money, and more importantly, it was a principle. Friday at 11:30 a.m., Gary Delaney called me. He sounded like a man who had not slept well. He said the board had met by conference call Thursday evening. He said they were prepared to formally withdraw the noise and nuisance violation notice and the aesthetic violation notice related to the generator. He also said, with the careful tone of someone reading from a script prepared by an attorney, that the HOA acknowledged the existence of the shared infrastructure arrangement and wanted to discuss a path forward, including potentially formalizing the arrangement with a utility easement and compensation structure. I said that sounded like a reasonable starting point, and that I'd have my attorney draft a term sheet for their review. Then I asked Gary, very casually, whether Pamela Fairbanks had authorized or approved the original complaint notices. He said she had submitted them through her board role. I said I wanted that confirmed in writing. He said he'd include it in the formal acknowledgement letter. We hung up and I immediately called Steve Mercer and told him everything. Steve started asking questions and taking notes, and I could hear the quiet excitement of a property attorney who had just been handed an interesting situation. He asked me to send him everything. I sent him the full email thread, all the attachments, the code enforcement visit documentation, the site plan, and a written summary of the Thursday conversation, where I'd notified the HOA of the infrastructure situation. The formal acknowledgement letter from Crestview arrived Friday afternoon by email. It confirmed that both violation notices were withdrawn. It confirmed that Pamela Fairbanks had submitted them in her capacity as a board member. It acknowledged the shared infrastructure situation and expressed the board's desire to resolve it amicably through a formal utility arrangement. It was signed by Gary Delaney, and I noticed, also by the HOA board president, a man named Robert Chu, whom I'd never had any trouble with. Robert, it turned out, had been furious when he learned the full situation and had apparently had some very direct conversations with Pamela on Thursday night after Gary briefed him on the site plan revelation. Power was restored to the neighborhood Saturday morning, ahead of the utility company's estimate. The grid came back on at about 8:15 a.m., and within 30 minutes, most of the lights in the neighborhood were coming on as people's heating systems kicked back on. I could actually hear distant cheers from down the street when power returned, which I thought was charming. My houseguests packed up and went home over the course of Saturday morning. Ruth Esperanza hugged me 3 times and said she was going to bring me a casserole next week. The Aquifer kids drew me a thank you card that said "Generator Man" with a crayon drawing of what I think was supposed to be the generator, though it looked more like a toaster on wheels. I kept the card. Still have it on my fridge. With power restored, my generator completed its automatic cool-down cycle and shut off, transferring the house back to utility power seamlessly. The concrete pad and the generator sitting on it looked a little anticlimactic in the returning Saturday morning light, just a gray machine under an equipment screen, nothing dramatic. But that machine had kept 8 people warm through 4 days of genuinely dangerous cold, and I felt pretty good about that. The gate, when utility power came back, resumed normal operation without missing a beat. The transition was so smooth that I doubt most residents even noticed the difference. But the story wasn't quite finished yet. Steve Mercer spent the following week drafting 2 things simultaneously. The first was a utility easement proposal for the HOA, formally documenting the shared infrastructure arrangement, and proposing a retroactive compensation structure for the emergency fuel use, plus a going-forward maintenance fee tied to the gate system's power consumption from my service, since disconnecting the junction box would apparently require significant rerouting work that neither the HOA nor the utility company was eager to fund immediately. The proposal was reasonable, and Steve drafted it in language that was firm but not adversarial. The second thing Steve drafted was a formal complaint to the state HOA Oversight Board regarding the conduct of Pamela Fairbanks in submitting violation notices against a homeowner during a declared state of emergency, notices that were demonstrably without factual or legal basis, and that had resulted in a county code enforcement visit despite the installation being fully permitted and compliant. I want to be clear about something here. I'm not a vindictive person. I don't enjoy conflict for its own sake, but what Pamela had done wasn't just annoying. She had, during a genuine emergency, filed false and misleading complaints against me with both the HOA and county code enforcement. She tried to have my generator shut down while temperatures were life-threatening. She then tried to gaslight the neighborhood by going door to door suggesting I was some kind of threat. And she'd done all of it from a position of HOA authority that she'd partly invented for herself. That warranted a formal response, not out of spite, but because people who abuse positions of power over their neighbors, especially during a winter emergency when people are physically vulnerable, should face real accountability. The state HOA Oversight Board complaint was filed in late January. These things move slowly, but they move. The board acknowledged receipt within 2 weeks and opened an inquiry. The utility easement negotiation with the HOA was actually smoother than I expected. Robert Chu, the board president, turned out to be a decent guy who was genuinely embarrassed by the whole situation. He called me directly one evening in early February and apologized personally for how the complaint process had been handled. He said the board had been reviewing Pamela's activity as vice president of community standards and had discovered that the committee she ran had been sending out violation notices without proper board review or approval, which was actually a violation of their own bylaws. Several of those notices, including mine, had been issued without the formal vote or review process they were supposed to go through. The board was in the process of auditing 2 years of violation notices she'd issued. Robert also told me, speaking carefully, that they'd discovered that Pamela had been collecting what she called administrative coordination fees from a landscaping company she'd steered HOA contracts toward, which was not disclosed in any meeting minutes and which looked, depending on how the accountants characterized it, somewhere between a conflict of interest and something considerably more serious. He didn't elaborate further, but he said the board had referred the matter to their attorney and that there would be more to come. I appreciated Robert's candor. I told him I thought the easement negotiation should move forward separately from whatever was happening with Pamela, and he agreed. We had a draft agreement finalized by mid-February that had the HOA paying me a small monthly fee tied to the actual power draw from the junction box, and reimbursing me retroactively for the emergency fuel cost, which Steve had calculated at $54 and change. I told Steve the retroactive amount was almost insultingly small, and he said that wasn't the point, and he was right. The point was that it was acknowledged and documented. The HOA had formally recognized that they had, for 15 years, been drawing power from my service without knowing it, and they were now paying for it on an ongoing basis until a permanent rerouting solution was engineered. February brought more snow, though nothing as dramatic as the January ice storm. The neighborhood returned to something like normal. I shoveled my driveway, attended to my regular routine, and watched from a comfortable distance as the HOA drama quietly unfolded. The state HOA Oversight Board inquiry concluded in March. Their findings were that Pamela Fairbanks had issued violation notices outside of proper board procedure, that some of those notices had been issued without factual basis, and that her conduct during the January emergency period specifically constituted an abuse of her board authority. The Oversight Board issued a formal sanction against her personally, and against the HOA board collectively, for inadequate oversight of a board member's actions. The sanction included a requirement for the board to audit and potentially void 2 years of improperly issued violation notices, and to implement a formal review process for all future notices. The HOA was also required to issue written apologies to all homeowners who had received improperly processed violation notices, which I'm told numbered about 34 over 2 years, more than half of them attributed to Pamela's committee. Now, here's where things got a little more serious. The accounting firm the HOA brought in to audit their finances as part of the Oversight Board requirements found something in the landscaping contract history that Robert had hinted at. Over 3 years, the HOA had paid a landscaping company called Premier Green Services a total of about $112,000 in contracts. Premier Green Services had been selected each year over lower bids, with the selection apparently pushed through by Pamela citing quality considerations she never formally documented. The accounting firm found that Pamela Fairbanks had received a total of approximately $16,000 in referral consideration payments from Premier Green Services over the same period, paid to a personal checking account. She had never disclosed this to the board or the homeowners. Under the HOA's governing documents and state law, This was a clear breach of fiduciary duty. Under state financial statutes, it was potentially criminal. The HOA's attorney referred the matter to the county district attorney's office in April. I found this out through the neighborhood app, where someone had seen Pamela's car parked outside what appeared to be a law office on a weekday morning, and then through a follow-up conversation with Robert, who confirmed the referral without giving details. In May, Pamela Fairbanks was charged with 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty under state nonprofit organization law and 1 count of theft by deception, both related to the undisclosed referral payments. She resigned from the HOA board the same day the charges were filed. I heard she hired a criminal defense attorney and was negotiating with the DA's office. The neighborhood was, in a word, shaken. Not everyone had liked Pamela, but she'd been a fixture in the HOA for 6 years, and a lot of people hadn't seen it coming. I'd suspected she was operating with some personal agenda beyond just being irritating, but the financial angle had surprised even me. Dave Kowalski called me when the news broke and said, "All of this started because she reported your generator." I said, "Yeah, I guess it did." He laughed and said that was the most Maplewood Estates thing that had ever happened. The criminal proceedings moved through the spring and into the summer. In July, Pamela pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of financial mismanagement under a state HOA-specific statute, avoided jail time, but was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, required to repay the HOA the full $16,000 with interest, and banned from serving on any HOA or community association board in the state for 10 years. The DA's office released a brief statement that said the case served as a reminder that HOA board members have genuine fiduciary responsibilities to their communities, and that those responsibilities are enforceable under law. The HOA itself, operating under oversight board supervision, spent the summer auditing and reforming its practices. The 34 improperly issued violation notices were all voided. Homeowners who had paid fines under those notices received refund letters. Mine amounted to $250 in fines I'd paid over 2 years, which I got back with interest, a total of $263. I used it to buy a nice propane regulator upgrade for the generator. Robert Chu, to his genuine credit, reorganized the board structure. He brought in 2 new members through a proper election that included actual campaigning, which nobody had done before because previously Pamela had made the process so unpleasant that most people didn't want to participate. The new board eliminated the self-appointed vice president of community standards role entirely. They rewrote the violation notice procedure to require a full board vote before any notice could be issued. They published the revised HOA budget with full transparency, and they started holding quarterly town halls in the community room where residents could ask questions and raise concerns. Attendance at the first town hall was high enough that they ran out of chairs. I went to that first town hall, sat in the back, listened to Robert give a summary of everything the board had changed and why. He acknowledged the oversight failures that had allowed one board member to operate without adequate checks for years. He didn't name Pamela by name, but everyone knew who he meant. He thanked the residents who had raised concerns and pushed back, and he specifically mentioned that a formal complaint filed by a homeowner had been one of the catalysts that brought the infrastructure issues and board misconduct to the oversight board's attention. A few people turned around and looked at me when he said that. Dave caught my eye from across the room and gave me a nod. Marcus Acaffer, sitting a few seats away with Sandra, gave me a quiet thumbs up. Ruth Esperanza, who was at the town hall despite it being a weeknight and relatively cold, caught my eye and smiled. After the town hall, I talked to Robert briefly. He shook my hand and said he was genuinely glad that the generator complaint had gotten pushed back on, because without that pushback, the financial issues might have stayed buried for years longer. He said that in a strange way, The ice storm had been a useful catalyst. I said that wasn't the way I'd have chosen to spend January, but I appreciated the sentiment. The easement agreement I'd signed with the HOA was finalized and recorded with the county in August, making the shared infrastructure arrangement officially documented in the property records. The HOA also commissioned an engineering study for permanently rerouting the gate's power supply to the main community service, which was expected to be completed the following year. In the meantime, the monthly fee arrangement continued, and I updated my records accordingly. By the time September rolled around, things at Maplewood Estates were genuinely different. The gate worked. The landscaping contracts had been rebid through a transparent process, and Premier Green Services had not been selected. The violation notices that came out under the new procedure were rare, clearly documented, and nobody received one for a gray welcome mat. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had previously been about 50% Pamela posting reminders about HOA rules and 50% people quietly resenting it, was now used for things like organizing snow-clearing help for elderly residents, sharing information about local services, and as the fall arrived, planning a neighborhood Halloween event. I tested the generator in October as I do every year, ran it for 30 minutes, checked the connections, topped off the propane. It started perfectly, hummed along without complaint, and then shut off on schedule. The equipment screen I'd installed around it was weathering nicely. The concrete pad was solid. The county permit sticker was still visible in the corner. I thought about that January night while I did the maintenance checks. The temperature dropping, the lights going out across the neighborhood, the generator kicking on, 8 people in my living room playing board games. Ruth winning at Scrabble by a margin that should have been embarrassing for the rest of us. Pamela Fairbanks standing in her driveway in the cold, arms crossed, staring at the one house in the neighborhood with the lights on, and deciding that her first move was going to be a violation notice. The irony was rich, and I didn't need to do anything to make it sharper. She'd reported the generator. The generator was running the gate she used to leave and return to her own house every single day. When she'd had the code enforcement officer come to inspect the installation, she'd needed the gate to open for him, and the gate had opened because of the power my generator was supplying. She tried to have my equipment shut down using an authority she'd partly made up for herself, and the tools she was using to threaten me were running on power I was providing. It would have been almost poetic if it hadn't been so cold and so genuinely dangerous. But here's what I keep coming back to when I think about the whole thing. The ice storm was real. The danger was real. People in the neighborhood were struggling with frozen pipes and failing heating systems and dangerous temperatures. And while all of that was happening, while I was housing 8 of my neighbors and running a generator that was keeping people safe, Pamela Fairbanks was using her position on the HOA board to try to get my equipment shut down. Not because of any genuine safety concern, not because of any real violation, because she found the sound of the generator annoying, and because she didn't like that I'd done something she hadn't thought to do herself. That's what an HOA becomes when the wrong person gets comfortable in a position of power for too long. It stops being about the community and starts being about control. About who gets to decide what the neighborhood looks like and sounds like and how people are allowed to use their own property. The rules become weapons, not guidelines. The authority becomes personal. The good news, and I genuinely believe this, is that it doesn't have to stay that way. You just have to push back, document everything. Know the rules better than the person using them against you. Understand what the actual law says, not just what the HOA says the law says. File the proper responses, through the proper channels, with the proper documentation. And when someone tries to have your generator shut down during an ice storm, make sure you know exactly what else that generator is running, because you might just find out that the person trying to turn off your lights is standing behind a gate that's powered by your extension cord. The December town hall had a different feel than the September one. Better attended, more relaxed. Someone brought a big tray of holiday cookies. The budget presentation was clear and detailed, which meant nobody had to ask the tense, uncertain questions about where the money was going that had been common for years. Robert announced that the gate rerouting project had a contractor selected, and work would begin in February, weather permitting. He also announced that the HOA had recovered the full $16,000 repayment from Pamela as part of her sentence, and that the money was being used to establish an emergency fund that would pay for things like temporary utility costs and infrastructure repairs during emergencies, starting with a properly installed and dedicated power supply for the gate, so that nobody's personal equipment would ever be in the position of subsidizing community infrastructure again. I thought that was a pretty good outcome, not just for the neighborhood but as a principle. After the December meeting broke up and people were mingling over cookies and cider, Dave cornered me by the snack table and said, "You know what's funny? If Pamela had just left you alone, none of this would have happened." I said, "I know." He said, "The generator would have just run, the gate would have just worked, and everything would have been fine." I said, "Probably." He thought about that for a second and then said, "She really reported your generator during an ice storm. She really did that." I said, "She really did." He shook his head. "And it powered her gate the whole time." I said, "The whole time." He laughed and went for another cookie, and I stood there for a moment in the warm community room, wearing my coat because the night outside was cold again, watching my neighbors talk and laugh and plan the neighborhood snow-clearing schedule, and thought that things had worked out about as well as they possibly could have, given that it all started with a woman in a winter coat standing in her driveway at 8 in the morning, glaring at a generator, picking up her phone. The generator's still out there on its concrete pad. Permitted, inspected, compliant, ready for the next storm. I tested it again last week, started up on the first cycle, ran clean and steady, and shut off on schedule. The equipment screen is holding up fine. The propane tank is full. Let Pamela report it again. See what happens.